that you disarm law-abiding good citizens and not the criminals, you can have a perverse impact and actually increase the crime rates. Now, I suppose the simplest way to think about this, before we get into a lot of the data here, and that is, let's say someone was stalking you or your family, was really stalking your wife, let's say. Would you feel safer putting a sign up in front of your home that said, "This home is a gun-free zone"? Would that make you feel safer to go and announce that? My guess is most people wouldn't feel safer doing that. And the reason why they wouldn't feel safer for doing that is, I think, pretty obvious, because they'd essentially be telling the criminals, or that person who's stalking their family, that that criminal or stalker has less to worry about. That they only have to worry about the people being able to defend themselves. And that rather than actually deterring the person with the weapon from entering the house, what it'll actually do is make it more likely that he'll do it. That these types of signs actually serve as a magnet for causing these types of attacks to occur. And what I would argue is that for places like the UT campus, we actually have these signs almost up in neon, essentially, telling everybody that when it comes to the University of Texas campus or other schools, that concealed handguns, that the potential victims that they face aren't going to be armed. Now, we'll go through the data for DC and Chicago in a second, but there's some who go and argue that these aren't really fair tests. Gun control proponents say, okay, it didn't work exactly right, but that's because we didn't have a gun ban across the entire country. It was possible for criminals to go and get guns from other areas and bring them into the places where the gun ban is true. I would bring 2 points. One is that it would have been nice if they had shared it with everybody else that they didn't think that these were fair tests to have. But the second point is that these results, these increases in murders and other violent crimes, aren't just limited to Chicago and DC. Around the world, time after time, in places where the entire nation adopts these bans, or even island nations where they don't have any nearby neighbor that they can go and blame for being a source of guns, also see increases in murder rates and other types of violent crimes. There are many areas of U.S. life where we have these types of gun bans or have had them. But often what I find when I talk to people is they kind of assume that whatever law is currently in place is the way the law has always been. So for example, after 9/11, I consulted a lot with the airline pilots unions about being able to have pilots carry guns on planes. And often in the discussion, you'd hear similar types of stories to what's being brought up now, where they'd say, well, what happens if a pilot accidentally fires a gun? Or what happens if a pilot, goes berserk, or what have you? Other potential hypothetical things that might occur. Well, my response, after working with the pilots unions, there's so many things that you find out that you just never knew were true. So for example, most of you probably don't know that all commercial airline pilots in the United States from 1924 up until 1963 were mandated to carry a loaded handgun with them when they flew in the United States. They were allowed to carry handguns with them up until 1979. Where, according to the pilots unions, regularly about 10% of pilots still carry their handguns with them. And yet, with all that experience, over all those decades, the FAA has not one single record of anything going wrong with all those pilots carrying concealed handguns. You would think that there would be at least one story, but there's not. And so, when people would bring up hypothetical cases about things that might happen, I thought the best argument would say, well, what did happen when we had this experience? Things like whether we should have guns on college campuses. Most people think, well, because we have bans now, wasn't that always the case? And in fact, this is a relatively new phenomenon. These types of rules and restrictions only go back about 16, 17 years or so. Prior to that, there were no restrictions on virtually any college campuses around the country banning people carrying concealed handguns or other guns on campus. And in fact, a lot of states had right to carry laws, and people with those permits had no restrictions, whether they were faculty or staff or students, as long as they met the requirements and were able to carry the guns onto college campuses. And yet, prior to that period of time, despite all that experience in all those states, Again, I can't find a single example of something going wrong on one of those campuses. Now, since then, we still have states, Colorado and Utah, have laws on the books that say that in public campuses, people can carry permanent concealed handguns. There are many college campuses around the country that are able to do it, because most states leave it up to the schools to decide. But you know, there are probably most schools ban it when they have a choice for students. But my guess is, nobody's gone through this systematically, most schools allow faculty or staff to carry concealed handguns, because at least in the samples that I've been able to go through with faculty handbooks, you don't see restrictions applying to them that apply to the students. And again, as we mentioned, this is other countries. So what I thought I'd show you is just some data from DC and Chicago here. This is murder rates for DC relative to other cities in the top 50 cities. Before I go through this for a second, I just want to tell you a couple things. DC's handgun ban went into effect in February 1977 after a restraining order that had been imposed by the courts were removed. DC's murder rates in the year prior to the ban among these top 50 cities ranged from about ranked 20th to 15th. In the 30 years after the ban was imposed, DC's murder rate ranked number 1 or number 2 among the 50 largest cities half the time, and ranked in the top 4 2/3 of the time. So it was a dramatic increase, not only relative to DC's past murder rate, but also relative to other cities. This just compares the ratio of DC's murder rate to the average for the other 48 cities. Chicago's also dropped out just because it also imposes a ban, but including it because it's just one city, has no real impact on these lines. DC's murder rate was falling relative to other cities prior to the ban. Basically goes down to about 10% above the other cities in '76. And then afterwards, it soars. I mean, it goes from about 10% above to about 45% above the murder rate in other cities. And it basically stays there afterwards. I could go and show you for periods of time after 87, where the reason why I showed you just this is, you know, 40–50% increases here. They look tiny compared to how DC's murder rate soared relative to other cities after the crack cocaine epidemic hit. This is DC's murder rate relative to Maryland and Virginia. You can see it's rising afterwards. There's no year after the ban where it's lower than it was before the ban. And again, this is continuing out. This is DC's murder rate relative to the US, and again, carrying out. Now, one thing that's gotten very little attention is, while people may understand how DC's murder rate went up after the ban, there's almost no coverage about how it's fallen after the Supreme Court struck down the ban. About 2 weeks ago, the FBI came out with its new Uniform Crime Report numbers for 2009. And what you can see is that last year, Washington, D.C.'s murder rate fell by 23% compared to 2008. Nationally, murder rates fell by about 7%. If you look at just cities over 500,000 in population, which would be kind of DC's class, they fell by about 8%. So DC's murder rate fell by about 3 times faster last year than the national average, going down to a rate of about 23.5 per 100,000 people. That's DC's lowest rate since 1967.